and private markets are quite rapidly growing in developing countries to supply services like education and health. But of course, there's inbuilt inequalities there because it's inaccessible to most people who are not of a certain income level. And so we find that goods such as clean water, sanitation, basic health care, schooling, and so forth of a certain quality level are not evenly distributed. So I think, these are really important questions to ask, to look at, the politics of service provision, given how fundamental service provision is to growth, to development, and to reducing inequality. Why am I focusing on it, on non-state delivery? In part because that's what I've worked on, but also because non-state providers are on the rise. And we know that development agencies have emphasized the importance of non-state actors in supplying services, or at a minimum public-private partnerships in delivering such services. So I think there's a lot to look at there. And really, we need to know more about the implications of non-state service provision for development, for reducing inequalities. We really actually know quite little. So to what extent is the provision of basic services by non-state providers actually effective in promoting development, in generating broader access to basic services? Now, I want to sort of make two overarching arguments here and then go into some more detail to develop them, and then talk a little bit about some work that I'm doing right now that's related to these questions, ongoing work. So first, I have done the edited volume that still counts with Lauren Morris McLean at Indiana called The Politics of Non-State Social Welfare. We focused on some of these issues, and sort of our punchline, we had a really great cast of characters contributing to that volume. So if I can make a plug, I would say definitely read the middle chapters. They're really good. And I know most people just skip over those. And I learned quite a lot from the contributors to this volume. And so based on the kind of arguments that we were making in the book and the evidence that all of these contributors generated in their work, we sort of made two overarching claims. One is that non-state provision is no panacea, and the state retains a really vital role in promoting development and reducing inequalities. There just is no substitute for the state in meeting basic needs for most citizens, and particularly in developing countries. And this includes places where non-state provision is prevalent. And at a minimum, if the state is not the provider, then you need effective states that will serve an important regulatory function in order to make non-state provision more effective, more equitable, and so forth. So all things being equal, state involvement in service provision is needed to reduce inequalities. I expect that's not a sort of a revolutionary argument to many of the people in this room. But the other component of our work and ongoing work is that it's not all black and white, and that not all non-state providers are the same. So what we tried to do is sort of unpack the range of non-state provision and what they mean, what non-state provision by different types of non-state providers means for outcomes that we all might be interested in, things like access to services and the accountability of service providers. So not all providers are the same. They have different missions and characteristics, and also they operate in different contexts. And I think context is very important as well. So it's very hard to make sort of sweeping generalizations about this type of provider does well, because it's also very context dependent. And I'll elaborate a little bit what I mean by that and give you some concrete examples. So if the implications of non-state provision vary, then under what conditions can non-state providers play a role in driving development and reducing inequalities? And I think this is a really critical question that's by no means resolved. I think there's a lot of opportunities for research in this field. So what do we mean by non-state providers? And we develop a typology in our work that differentiates depending on whether they're domestically rooted or international organizations, and varies on a scale from, informality to very formally structured, institutionalized organizations with rules and boards and charters and so forth. So this could be anything from like hometown associations or slum dweller associations, to community-based organizations, to religious charities, to the sectarian political parties that I've worked on, or ethnic parties, to NGOs that don't have an ethnic, religious, or political orientation. Multinational corporations on the international side are involved, of course, in corporate social responsibility initiatives, international NGOs. So there's a huge range of actors that we can put in this non-state provider space, well beyond NGOs, which have really been the focus of most of the research in non-state provision. And so we focused on actually three main outcomes: access to services, the accountability of providers, and the implications of non-state provision for state capacity. I'll just focus briefly on a couple of those, on access and accountability, and say a few things about what we found, and then talk a little bit more about ongoing work in this area. So when I talk about access, at the most basic level, I'm referring to the degree to which people are able to meet their basic needs for services such as medical care, education, basic services, and so forth. But it's not just, do they actually have access to a quantity of services, but also quality. And I think this is something that we've tended to neglect in the social sciences. For obvious reasons, it's really hard to measure quality. It's really hard to know how good services are, and these tend to be in the purview of specialists and highly technical things, like the quality of primary health care or the quality of education and so forth. I mean, there are some indicators, like in education, people often use test scores and so forth, but of course there's problems with these kinds of indicators, and financing doesn't necessarily tell us that much either. The percentage of GDP that's spent on health or education, because of course financing can be wasted and may not go where it's supposed to go and so forth. So when we talk about access, we're not just talking about quantity, but also the quality of services and the equity of access to these services, as well as the sustainability of access. So you can have a really great program coming in by some international NGO that disappears in 3 years after the NGO's contract is up and shuts down. So sustainability is an important dimension of access as well. And when we're talking about accountability, of course, the ability of citizens to hold their providers to account for accessing these services, for not just the quantity, not just the actual access to the service, but also the quality, also to hold them account for the experience of accessing services as well. So what do we find in general, looking at this broad array of cases that we included in our book and on non-state provision? In general, a pattern that we saw consistently across a wide variety of cases and a wide variety of types of non-state providers is that on net, non-state providers do a good job in filling holes, but they tend to either reinforce existing inequalities or perhaps create new ones in terms of providing access to services. And in terms of accountability, this obviously very much depends on the type of provider, but oftentimes what you see is the introduction of non-state providers complicates chains of accountability by adding more layers onto the accountability process. But as I said, it's not sort of black and white. Not all non-state providers have these negative effects. And so we try to look very carefully at what are the characteristics of different non-state providers that might affect these outcomes. Whether they have a profit orientation, whether they are domestically rooted or not, whether they're more formalized or highly informal, what their eligibility criteria are. And I want to stop for a second on the eligibility criteria because I think this is a really important point, is that not all non-state providers have a mission to serve all. So at least rhetorically, often not in practice, but at least rhetorically with states, they are there to serve at a minimum citizens in their national territories, but non-state providers don't necessarily have such missions. These missions may be quite circumscribed depending on the type of actor that they are. So just to throw an example from my research, I looked at political parties that are supplying social welfare in the Lebanese context, and there is this strong social norm of universality and universal access to services. So all of the parties claim we serve all, we don't discriminate, and so forth. But in practice, that's not the way it actually works. And some of them actually don't make such universalistic claims. So just to throw out a sort of extreme, obvious example, take some of the social programs of Hezbollah, a Shia Muslim political party and militia based in Lebanon. They have some social programs that are explicitly reserved for fighters in their militia. So clearly that's not an inclusive criterion by definition, and they're quite honest about this. And they're not, I'm not just picking on them, they're not the only party that has, such an exclusionary set of criteria for access to their services. So the very eligibility criteria may be circumscribed. And then just to take a more benign example, not NGOs and other types of non-state providers often are very resource constrained and geographically limited. So by definition, they don't have resources at a national scale that are able to reach large portions of the population and large parts of the territory. So there's just inbuilt reasons why non-state provision in and of itself is not a solution to increasing access unless you have a sort of strong coordination, let's say, with a state that's regulating where these actors serve and ensuring access and so forth. And then in terms of the of mechanisms of accountability, I mentioned that one consistent theme that kept coming up in different settings in the research that our contributors did is that often we find very fragmented mechanisms and chains of accountability when you have more non-state providers involved. And so I'll just throw out one example from the work of Alejandra Mizala and Ben Ross Schneider in Chile. They did some work on private education in Chile, and so what they found is that even though most children are enrolled in private rather than public schools in this context, the broader structure of the Chilean education system compelled parents to address their claims to the state. So the privatization of education was designed to sort of boost the short route of accountability, if you're familiar with, of course, the 2004 World Development Report with the short route of accountability and the long route of accountability. And in practice, what happened is it sort of added another layer in which parents not only interfaced with the school, the short route of accountability, but also had to redress claims to the state. So it sort of added another pathway of accountability. Now, again, I've sort of alluded to the fact that the context in which these organizations operate really matters a lot in terms of their implications for development and equity considerations. And Chile is sort of a remarkable example in developing country context because it has relatively high state capacity to regulate welfare provision. And the state has introduced, and this is something that they document, various measures to try to promote accountability for performance in the schools, but the state remains a focal point for accountability mechanisms in this example. Now, this is not typical of many developing countries, and certainly not the places where I do a lot of work in the Middle East and North Africa. You often don't have states that seem to have that level of capacity. So, I don't mean to imply that, we should all just, ditch all the non-state provision and have completely public welfare systems, because there's a reason why non-state providers pop up, because there's neglected areas, and states often are not doing a very good job or an equitable job either. But the point is to inject a note of caution in terms of this reliance on non-state provision, and to think more carefully about the conditions under which non-state providers actually do increase access to services and are accountable to their beneficiaries and to citizens more generally. So I want to say, am I doing all right on time here?
I've got about a third of your time left.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, I better speed up then. So I just want to say a few words about identity politics and access to services, and then say a few words about some ongoing work that I have on this issue of the quality of service provision. So as we know, in some contexts, economic inequalities, social inequalities are very much tied to things like ethnicity, religion, race, and so forth. And in some contexts, you actually have such groups like sectarian parties or religious groups or ethnic groups actually directly supplying services, certainly in parts of the Middle East, certainly in parts of South Asia and India and elsewhere, and Southeast Asia at a minimum. And so this really raises some, I think, critical questions that we need to address and are being addressed about whether these kinds of identities, whether they're religious, ethnic, racial, are always a problem in terms of trying to promote development and equality. And also, I think an important question is, how well do these groups actually do in supplying services? That's a question that I'm working on right now. So we know from the vast literature in economics, political science, and the social sciences more generally, that the conventional wisdom is when you have these kinds of ethnic and religious divisions in society, they tend to be associated with poorer economic and social outcomes, worse delivery of public goods, and so forth, even if we don't fully understand what the mechanisms are at play. But this is a finding that seems to hold up consistently across a number of settings. And so, do these divisions automatically condemn societies to poor social and economic outcomes? Not necessarily. Matthias has worked with Prerna Singh and has shown that under some conditions this is not the case. And we know also the work of Edward Miguel on Kenya and Tanzania that actually such ethnic divisions, for example, don't necessarily pose a problem for public goods provision in places where you've had a sort of nation building project and so forth. You tend to see better public goods provision. And also these kinds of, these divisions themselves, the fact of the politicization of religious or ethnic divisions themselves is in fact probably endogenous to building more capable national level or inclusive welfare regimes. And so that's the lesson of the Tanzanian case, although it may come at a cost. But I would call your attention to something that the president of Lebanon said in the late 50s, early 60s. There was a president named Michel Shihab who had it as a mission to construct a more inclusive national welfare regime, more extensive public goods, roads, infrastructure, and so forth across the national territory. And he explicitly said in one of his speeches that we want to do this not just to increase access to these much needed goods to promote welfare and development, but also because we will create a national identity by doing so. So he explicitly said this in a public speech. And I think there's a lot of truth to it. Of course, politics got in the way, and there were too many vested interests, and they undercut his national welfare, welfare nation-building project. But clearly, he was a social scientist and had recognized the relationship between building national infrastructure and forging national identities. So one thing that does seem pretty consistent across a wide range of literature is that once you get these identities politicized, it's kind of hard to unroll the process, to sort of depoliticize them. Not impossible, but it's hard. And they tend to be associated with inferior social outcomes, with inferior public goods provision, and so forth. So in many societies, these kinds of actors, religious actors, sectarian groups, ethnic parties, ethnic groups, and so forth, are meeting the basic needs of their communities. And so I think it is a really important and interesting research question to ask, under what conditions do they do a very good job? And so I spent a heck of a lot of time in research, earlier research that I did in the schools and hospitals and health centers and social assistance programs of all kinds of NGOs and religious charities and political parties and ethnic and sectarian groups in the Middle East. And just from the very systematic eyeball test, I could see that there's wide variation in the quality of services that they provide. So I got interested in this question of, when is it that they supply good services? And also, if you talk to people in, say, Lebanon or other places in the region, they'll say, the reason they win support is because they supply these social welfare goods. So people actually believe that this is a mission of these organizations to supply goods to win support. And people who even hate, let's say, Hezbollah will say, they do a great job at supplying services. Then they get very cynical about it and say, and that's because they're trying to win support. But there is this perception that some groups are doing a better job than others. So I got really interested in this question of why is it, is it true? Because it's one thing to sort of walk into a place and say, it looks like they're supplying better services, but it's another thing to actually know whether that's the case. And B, if it's true, why is it the case? So I just want to say a few words about, in 4 minutes, okay, I'm going to say like 3 words about this. What explains this variation? And I'm doing this big project now in Lebanon, again, at the national scale. And Lebanon's a really interesting place to do this kind of work because it is a place that has a huge variety of non-state providers across the full spectrum. And I'm focusing on domestic only, not international organizations, for religious charities from all religious communities, these sectarian parties, NGOs that are explicitly not religious or political, in fact, are quite anti-sectarian, and public sector facilities. So we've got all these actors in the services game. And we're focusing on primary healthcare provision and have developed a set of survey instruments that quite systematically measure multiple dimensions of the quality of primary healthcare provision and are also collecting data on factors that we think might affect the quality. And so to make a long story short, we ran a very large-scale pilot study in Lebanon a couple years ago and have a paper coming out on that and those results. And they showed some very counterintuitive findings, which were that both on objective measures, and I'm happy to go into what those are for those of you that might be curious, and subjective measures, that is patient satisfaction and ratings and all that, people consistently, secular, anti-sectarian NGOs delivered better services. And if you're familiar with this context, it's sort of strange because they're broke. They have no resources. They're not in the patronage game. They don't control large networks, financial networks, and so forth. So it's sort of puzzling, but we think that's actually part of the explanation. So what happens, and we saw very consistent findings from this large-scale pilot, that different types of doctors select into different types of facilities, and that people differentially rate these doctors for their services provided. So what we think is going on is that those organizations that are against the corrupt sectarian system and that are explicitly anti-sectarian and don't play patronage politics disproportionately attract more professionalized staff. that are not involved in it for patronage politics, and that people recognize this. That they obviously, ordinary people, myself included, are often not capable of recognizing when better care is delivered in objective technical terms, but they sort of ascribe different motivations to the doctors that they see depending on where they're working. So they view these doctors that are not in the religious or sectarian groups, that are not in the patronage networks, as sort of more pure of heart and delivering services in conformity with, say, the Hippocratic Oath more. So that seems to be what we're finding, but we have a lot more. We have a national scale-up going on now where we can really test this much more systematically, and also a variety of other hypotheses related to whether quality of services varies depending on when you have organizations operating in religiously mixed areas or religiously more homogeneous areas, and a whole bunch of other things like that. So the lesson to me there is that two things really. One is, we need to think about factors in frontline service providers that motivate providers to deliver services. So we know, say, from the literature on the quality of primary healthcare or healthcare in general, that provider effort is really important in the quality of services and the quality of medical care delivered. So intrinsic motivation really matters, and what kinds of places attract more intrinsically motivated people is an important question in and of itself. But the other thing is that this may be very context specific. And so different political and social contexts are likely to have different dynamics in this non-state provider sector. So let me just throw out one clear example. A colleague at the University of Louisville did some interesting work in Egypt prior to the uprisings, in which he asked people to rate the quality of health services at different providers. And he put these hypothetical Islamic providers on his survey. They don't even exist. And he said, would the charitable Crescent Society deliver better services than the healthcare society? So, cueing people on the Islamic religious charitable orientation of the organization delivering services. And in Mubarak's Egypt, where the state was viewed as very corrupt and was a secular state, people viewed these Islamic charitable providers as superior providers, even when they don't exist. People just rate them higher. And I think the opposite goes on in a place where religion gets really politicized and is associated with corruption and patronage politics. So not only do you get different selection effects of who's selecting in to work in different types of places, but you also get perceptions varying depending on the political, social context of the quality of services. So just to wrap up, I think there's a lot of exciting research questions out there for us on non-state provision. There's many different providers operating in different contexts. So there's a lot more that we need to know. And I think this question of quality is really important because it is a fundamental dimension of access to services. You can have access to services, but if the doctors don't show up, exert any effort, and the medications have all expired, then you effectively don't have access to services. So I think quality is a really fundamental issue here. And in the current world historical moment we're living in, when states have been declining now, and the development policy prescriptions have been pushing public-private partnerships and non-state providers and NGOs and so forth, I think it's really imperative for us to understand better what makes for more equitable provision of services by these actors, and under what conditions are they promoting broader development. So thank you.
Thank you, Mattia. Thank you, Fulia. Just looking at everyone in this room, it's extraordinary, and I'm so excited. So many familiar faces, and it's an honor to be able to share this platform with Melani, who is a close friend and for many years was a colleague at Brown, and unfortunately left us for that university somewhere there north of Providence. But I'm glad to be able to run into her every once in a while at these conferences. So Matthias gave me marching orders. He sent me an email, a 2-page email, with 10 things I'm supposed to cover in 20 minutes. And I actually appreciate that because it gave me an opportunity to sort of step back and reflect a little bit on these big questions. And I want to begin with the title of this conference, which is, it's a fantastic provocation. It needs a question mark. Development in the face of global inequalities, right? I mean, we've all read Piketty, we've all followed the literature, we've all seen the rise of ethno-nationalist parties. We're all deeply concerned about global inequality. So I thought I'd start by saying, very briefly summarizing what this trend is, and then spending the rest of the talk exploring some possibilities for development within a context of increasing global inequalities. So, this is Marx's old argument, right? Capital will go in search of more of itself and remake itself in the eyes of the bourgeoisie. It will go universal. He said this in the Communist Manifesto, and now it's true. And we have the data to prove it, thanks to Thomas Piketty. The concentration of capital, which is more concentrated today than it's been since 1880, and the increasing mobility of capital, and that's really been the dynamic element that has driven inequality, is the master or the meta logic at work here. And it's compounded by the fact that there are, as we've learned in this last decade in particular, there are increasing returns to power, right? Economists sometimes say, oh, inequality, it incentivizes people, it's fine. If poverty is being reduced, why do we worry so much about inequality? Well, we should always worry about inequality because of the increasing returns to power, right? So look who's president in the United States of America, right? Corporate power. Modi, yes, he rode the tiger of communalism, but he is the avatar of corporate India, and one can, add many, many examples. Something that gets less discussed is just the way in which global production has been reorganized. We used to have national, bounded production systems. Today we have global commodity chains. And why is that significant? Well, it essentially undermines the capacity in the classic social democratic model of the working class to organize and to put demands on the state and to introduce equity-enhancing policies and measures that would be a countervailing force to the inequality-producing logic of capitalism. So that's harder to do today. Moreover, governance itself has been deterritorialized. Property is very well governed. You can go invest anywhere in the world, and your property, your investment is secure. That is nicely governed. Labor rights, maybe not so much. But the point is there is global governance, but it's global governance without global government. It's global governance without global representation. It's governance without democracy. And this is, of course, the key political problem. Having said all that, and Matthias already alluded to this, when you start actually looking at trends across the world, there's a bit of a quiet counter-movement that's been taking place. And I say quiet because it hasn't been marked by spectacular transitions per se, but in East Asia, we've seen the emergence of a creeping welfare state. Social expenditures in South Korea, Taiwan are up dramatically. Those are the democratic variants. Malaysia, which we rarely discuss in the literature, is actually one of the great success stories of reducing poverty in the post-World War II period. And of course, the case that we're all a little uncomfortable dealing with is China, where they've had actually dramatic success in expanding social provisioning, and basic social development indicators have improved dramatically, et cetera. So East Asia is an interesting, Latin America, and I think everyone knows this, the last 2 decades, notwithstanding the coup in Brazil, notwithstanding the new austerity measures, tremendous gains on the social development front. And then the toughest case of all, by far, India. And India is still struggling, but the last government, not the current one, UPA-2, introduced a series of rights-based welfare measures that are quite extraordinary. Now, of course, the capacity of the Indian state to actually fulfill those promises is another story. But in one sector, at least, NREGA, which is a program that guarantees a minimum level of work to the landless poor, is working quite well. It's working so well that wages are up in rural India. And if there's one thing you want to do to reduce inequality in India, is raise rural wages. So there's some stuff happening. And then even if you just look globally at basic indicators, the standard social development indicators, they're actually doing quite well. So something's going on here. But it's tricky to disentangle this. Now, Sam gave me the perfect intro because in my early career, as he puts it, I was interested in social democratic welfare states, right? And we know how those work. We've got a huge literature on this. Ole Tornquist is here and John Harris, and are making, in their latest book, comparisons between Scandinavia and India. And Kerala was indeed, for me, a classic case of social democratic-like welfareism driven by an organized working class. But those classic models were rare to begin with, and they're becoming rarer and rarer, and for very good reasons. Capital is so mobile that the key ingredient in the social democratic compromise, which is being able to tax or secure part of the surplus, that's harder to do. Capital goes offshore, it can threaten exit, it undermines the bargaining power of labor. Labor itself, as I've already suggested, is disorganized. Danny Roderick has pointed out that India has been deindustrializing since 2001, right? So, the heroic working class of Marxist narratives, even numerically, is just not what it used to be. On the other hand, social provisioning is interesting, right? And Melani's already given us one story of the way non-state actors can advance social provisioning. Now, often we neglect social provision because it's not as sexy as redistribution and class compromise and universalism, et cetera. And yet, if you live in urban India, the most immediate thing you want is a place to go to the toilet or having access to basic water, right? This still remains, these very basic forms of social provision still remain some of the biggest challenges that cities, especially cities of the global south, face today. So we need to talk a lot more, as Melani's already argued, about social provisioning, including the very basic stuff. What's interesting about social provisioning is it's somewhat more politically feasible than the classic redistribution politics are. Oftentimes, the middle class benefits from better services, right? And this is especially true in Indian cities, for example, where the levels overall are quite low. There's actually fiscal mechanisms that work because you can tax non-mobile assets like property. So those are, by definition, easier to tax. And there's a lot of cases, Bogota is a famous one, in which you have the estratos taxation system. Rich neighborhoods are taxed to essentially subsidize poor neighborhoods. South Africa has also been very good at this. There's other problems in South Africa, but in South Africa, basically rich whites pay higher fees, both property taxes and fees for services, which has allowed South African cities to cross-subsidize service provisioning in townships and informal settlements. The demand side dynamic is interesting. We don't see the classic collective mobilization strategies of the working class are more difficult today given global commodity chains. On the other hand, we're seeing a lot of collective consumption struggles. South Africa has had 10 years of service delivery protests. That's what they're actually called. In India, insofar as there's urban mobilization, it takes place around issues of basic service delivery. Latin America, Brazil in particular, with the urban social movements, have had tremendous mobilization around these issues. So for whatever reasons, we're seeing a lot more mobilization, a lot more demand-side dynamic when it comes to social provisioning. Another interesting thing about rolling out basic services is, yes, they cost money. That's true. But it's really more about good governance. If you can get your governance mechanisms right, you can get more bang for your buck than if you don't have good governance, right? So instead of just focusing on fiscal resources, and Kerala is, for me, the quintessential case. At the time it started developing, it was one of the poorest states in India, and today it has HDI figures like Belgium, right? And it's still quite poor by international terms, right? So they did a lot more with very little, right? And I would argue that this is essentially about certain kinds of governance. Another thing that's great about social provisioning is it's labor intensive. You need nurses, you need plumbers, you need mechanics, you need frontline workers. Frontline workers are cheap compared to CAT scans, compared to high-end workers, right? And when you look at numbers on frontline states, India, we always think of India, red tape, big bureaucracy. India is one of the tiniest goddamn states in the world in terms of personnel. There's very little personnel there. There's a lot of people in Delhi making plans, a lot of technocrats, but when it comes to engineers on the ground who can actually deliver water services in Delhi, there's one engineer for 16,000 people. Right? Frontline states, we need more frontline states. Finally, there's multiplier effects, and Melani already pointed this out. If you provide better services, people have more access to the city, they can use the city, they're more mobile, they're healthier. Some public health experts estimate that 40% of all urban sickness and illness is due to poor sanitation. Right? So building sewers is really important. And then finally, productivity enhancing. All the theories of human capital formation and Sen's theories about capability enhancement emphasize the productivity enhancing effects of good delivery. All right, so usually when we have these debates, it's at the nation state level, which is fine. That's an important scale of analysis. But increasingly, I think the action is at subnational levels and in particular cities. So why cities? So first of all the future growth, demographic growth, is going to happen in cities. Demographers are very clear on this. All the future increases in poverty are happening mostly in cities, right? And cities have to deal with this extraordinary problem that Mike Davis, who has a knack for powerful, evocative phrases, he's argued that the cities of the global south today have to deal with the challenge of warehousing surplus populations, right? Unlike the European strategy of early economic development, where we dealt with our surplus peasantry by exporting them, that is not an option for most of the global south, right? India cannot export its surplus, low-skilled labor population, right? So cities are going to have to find a way to manage this. And the question isn't just one of income inequality, which is what the literature on global inequality tends to focus on. It's also about social exclusion, identities, caste, various divisions, social divisions. We know that cities are becoming, in a sense, the new loci of social inequality, sometimes through income differentials, but as you'll see in a moment, through other socio-spatial mechanisms. So we need to be more attentive to those. What are the challenges? I think one of the big challenges of the global south, the great deficit of the global south, is local democracy. So oftentimes at the national level, you have representative democracy, et cetera. But by the time it trickles down to the local level, what you get is bureaucratic authoritarianism. Right? Indians, they vote at the local level, but local governments have almost no power. So the first point at which there really is accountability is the provincial state. And the average provincial state in India is 50 million plus people. Right? So what is the mechanism of accountability if there's no local government? And Latin America is a bit better, but still, by Northern European standards, where 30+% of all expenditure is at the local level, in the global south, it's in the single digits. Right? So local government is one of the key institutional problems that many democracies of the global south in particular face. Ironically, China's local governments are much more powerful, much more capacitated, much more developmental than local governments in India. And there are reasons for this: colonial histories of authoritarianism, authoritarian regimes, by definition, like to centralize things. To the extent that they devolve anything, they do so through what Mamdani famously called decentralized despotism. And so you enforce these authoritarian, autocratic regimes at the local level. And of course, the great legacy of colonial rule in urban spaces is socio-spatial exclusion, right? And apartheid is the most sort of visible Braille version of that colonial legacy, because it was enforced as a matter of law, but throughout the global south you see these patterns. Interestingly, in the 1990s, you get a wave of democratic decentralization, including in two cases that I want to talk about. How am I doing on time?
Are you doing on time?
Oh, there's actually a clock
Yeah,
there.
you've got about 8 minutes.
8 minutes, good. 8 minutes for two cases, perfect. So India, I'll talk a bit about India, democratic, vibrant democracy that, as Atul Kohli famously put, is really badly governed. And what does he actually mean by that? You probably can't read this. Oh. Here we go. No. All right, it's in and out. But this is an electricity bill from a slum dweller. This gentleman has lived in this slum, which is in central Delhi, for 32 years. It reads, and only the Indian bureaucracy could ever come up with this kind of terminology, purely temporary arrangement without conferring any legal rights. He is a citizen without a city. That's a popularized term, right? He lives there, he pays his bill, he mobilizes politically to get services, but he does not have a right to be there. Right? Citizen without a city. So what does this actually look like? Uh-oh. Am I pointing it the wrong way?
Tech help? There you go.
Oh, good. Sam. Thank you, Sam. That's perfect right there. Okay. So we did a survey in Bangalore. This is with Ashutosh Varshney and Siddharth Swaminathan, 4,100 households. We don't really trust the census data on India when it comes to basic services, so we did our own thing. And this is just, so Bangalore, IT city, best governed city in India, lowest level of slums, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the best case scenario. And this is just measuring, we have an index of services delivered to households. It's a quite complex index. And this is just the bottom 3 deciles, right? And what's interesting is there's no difference between Hindus and Muslims. Now, this is true in Bangalore. It's probably not true in Delhi. But Bangalore, for whatever history, Muslim community, trading community, well-established historically, there's a story there. Caste introduces some differentials, which is not surprising. SC stands for scheduled caste, which is bureaucratic terminology for Dalits, so-called former untouchables. OBCs are the middle caste, others are the forward caste, so there's something going on there. But of course, the big driver is what kind of house you live in, which means what kind of neighborhood you live in, right? So dramatic difference. If you live in shacks and slums, 2/3 of that population is getting really poor services, whereas if you live in middle-class housing all the way through upper-class housing, and these are all public services, right? So we only measured public services. Sam, can you?
Next slide.
Yes, thank you. Melani talked about the quality of services. We wanted to measure the quality with which you can use your rights as a citizen. Right? How effective is your citizenship? So when your services don't work, your public services don't work, can you engage the state? Can you go to the bureaucracy and say, my water's overflowing, or my electricity is not working properly, or the street in front of my house floods every monsoon, et cetera, and please do something about it. As a citizen, I'm entitled to these basic things. Well, it turns out 50% of people in shacks never, ever go to the state. And fieldwork confirms this in shack settlements. If you go to the state at all, it's through a political intermediary, and then you're just playing the politics of patronage. You might get a water tanker to come service your community. You're never going to get piped water. But even then, the quality tends to be really poor. This is whether or not people report having to pay a bribe. And we know everybody underreports bribery, but even here, big chunks of people, just to deal with very basic problems, electricity connections, et cetera, are having to pay bribes. So this is what I call Indian apartheid, and it's a strong word. Doug Massey used it for the US. I figure I can use it to describe India. This is a system of legally sanctioned, differentiated citizenship. Now, it's not based on race, as was the case with apartheid. It's much more akin to the Chinese Haoku system. But these are the 8 settlement types in India. These are the official categories. This is official data. You have the millions of people living in these different settlements, percentages. The official legality based on policy positions of different departments, as well as court rulings that we analyzed at length. And then the effect on, to take one example, water supply. And these first 3 categories, 1, 2, and 3, that's 50% of the city. And this includes huge chunks of the middle class. There are government employees living here, university students, et cetera. And they're all either illegal or unplanned or not fully integrated into the city. They don't get water the way we would expect to get water, right? And I could add a lot of details, but basically only this segment of the population, which is a fourth, lives in neighborhoods that are legal and that are properly planned, which means town and planning criteria, et cetera, and get full services. Everyone else, it's a bit more liminal. These are sort of weird categories. But so this is a high degree of differentiated citizenship when it comes to access to very basic services. I know I have. Oh, all right, wait. There's a special effect here. Yeah, so go to this map. And then I'm going to ask you to click twice, but slowly. Not yet. So this is Brazil. HDI, you all know that the HDI is a very sticky measure. I mean, it's hard to move the HDI, really hard to move. And, very high. This is Belgium, this is Bihar, right? And so most of Brazil, especially the Northeast, looks like Bihar in 1991. But the South, more industrialized, Sao Paulo, et cetera, you're beginning to see higher levels. And now, Sam, 1, 2. Next one. Oh, can you go back?
There's no 2000.
Oh, are you sure?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, well, anyway, you see the difference, right? I mean, dramatic. In 2 decades, the HDI goes from Bihar to Belgium in most of Brazil, right, including the Northeast. Next one. And this includes Oh, quick comparison, India. So over the last 2 decades, Brazil has grown at an average of 3.5 to 4%. India's grown at an average of 6 to 7.5%. So India's been growing twice as fast. But the improvement in basic service delivery of piped water and flush toilets much better in Brazil than India. And the Indian numbers, we're convinced, are completely exaggerated. So when the Indian census says you have a flush toilet, the implication is that it's tied to a sewage system. Not. And we know because we went and looked at them, right? So you're talking, water drains outside the street or some other part of the house, but not into the sewage system. So, and what's striking here is, Sao Paulo, Rio, not so surprising. Salvador. Salvador is the classic city of colonial and plantation, slavery, economy, et cetera, and yet it has almost universal provisioning. And then if you break it down, and here I just want to show Salvador, infant mortality, which is a really good, one of the best measures of the rollout of public services is infant mortality. And Salvador, you see this just dramatic decline from 46 to 14 in 2 decades. All right, so something's going on. And my argument, and I'm almost done, is what's next. What's going on is that the quality of local governance in Brazil has improved dramatically in this period. Right? So with the '89 Constitution, Brazil decentralized resources and authority to municipalities. They also introduced all sorts of participatory reforms and mechanisms, participatory budgeting, sectoral councils, participatory planning. In some cities it works, in some cities it doesn't work. But what it's done is increase the quality of the interface or the embeddedness of the local state with civil society, right? And Brazilian civil society is quite sophisticated, it's very mobilized, very diverse, and they've been able to work with local states in various sectors: health, education, urban planning, transport systems, social housing, tremendous improvements, especially in cities like Sao Paulo, in the social housing sector. And Roberto Pires has done some fascinating research and put this data together. So this is his measure of participation. So he literally counted the number of sectoral councils or participatory institutions at the municipal level, and then classifies them into 3 categories: low, medium, and high intensity. And then here you simply have the increase of local level, frontline state officials contributing to public service provisioning. Right? And I'm not a stats guy, but I don't need a sophisticated model to tell you that there's a correlation here, right? And if you know Brazil, it sort of makes sense. Brazil, in the last 2 decades, added 5 million public employees, half of them at the municipal level, right? And it's mostly teachers and health staff. I'm almost done. Last slide. So just to come back to Matthias's provocation, is development possible in the face of global equality? Can cities be made more inclusive in the face of global inequality? Overall, I have no idea. In India, the trend does not look good, and largely for political reasons. India decentralized, constitutionally decentralized authority to cities in '91, and ever since then, the political party machines at the state level have blocked all devolution. Local government expenditure in India is 0.5 percentage point of GDP, compared to 8% in Brazil and 30-some% in Scandinavia, right? So Indian cities have very few resources that they control themselves. They don't even control the local bureaucracies. These tend to be controlled by ministers at the state level or central level parastatals. So there's no autonomy, right? Brazil, you have a lot of autonomy, but it's a regulated autonomy. There are minimum standards that are enforced in Bolsa Familia and health reform by federal authorities, including constitutional guarantees. And the federal authorities are really good about ensuring that the allocation of federal monies is done on a pro-development basis. So poor cities get more than rich cities, et cetera. That's what I call regulated autonomy. Brazilian cities have built capacity, adding frontline personnel. The nurses are so important. Right? The solution to most of our developmental problems is teachers and nurses. Right? They've added a lot of them. Great coordination, or better coordination than Indian cities. And by coordination, I mean the capacity of executives or planning authorities to coordinate the interventions of different line departments, which is crucial for things like social housing. And then finally, and I just want to end with this, embeddedness. State authorities cannot deliver by themselves. So whether they're delivering through non-state mechanisms, or they're co-producing delivery by working with CBOs, NGOs, social movements, This is a very synergistic relationship when done right, and it has to be done right. It can also devolve into capture, et cetera. And the key, I think, to forms of embeddedness that are synergistic is, one, expanding the surface area of the state. You have to be able to find the damn state, right? Citizens have to be able to engage with the state in a way that really does allow them to use their rights and not have to mobilize through politicians or brokers, et cetera. So that those direct forms of engagement are critical. And the Brazilian local state has dramatically expanded its surface area. And then finally, the mode of intermediation. We have to shift from the politics of clientelism, which may be fine at certain times for some communities to get some goods, but in terms of providing broad collective goods, like social provisioning, ultimately you need a right to the city. You have to make it work politically. It's hard to do, but Brazil and Kerala suggest that you can do it. Thank you.